For me.
Game over.
Nintendo may be known as the bright and happy kids company, but they can be pretty cold-blooded when it comes to their IP. For example, Sega hired people from the fan game community to make Sonic Mania. Valve has a number of fan mods, including a full remake of Half-Life, available on their storefront. When Capcom had to shut down a fan remake to avoid competition with their own, they asked the staff to shut it down, then invited them to Japan to see the real remake before the rest of the world and talk with them about game development. It's hard to be too mad about the shutdown when Capcom gave the staff a dream vacation and showed that they cared. And then there's Nintendo, who, after blowing Metroid's 30th anniversary with one of the most disastrous flops in recent memory, issued a series of takedown notices to a fan remake that had been anticipated for years. Fans were already upset, and it was obvious that this would make them even angrier. Nintendo had even more reason to reach out to the community than Capcom did, but their attitude seems to be that if you're using their IP, you're the bad guy. They don't owe you anything. More recently, Nintendo went after 2 ROM sites and sued the owners for $12 million, an amount that's obviously been inflated to deter other sites, like when the RIAA sued a woman $2 million for downloading Hella Good. Of course, Nintendo has the right to protect their property in any way they see fit, but having the right to do something doesn't always mean it's the right thing to do. Many companies have shown that you don't have to respond to fan creations with a hammer, and in the case of ROM sites, the issue is complicated because it's as much about preservation as it is about piracy. Companies can't always be trusted to preserve their work and make it easily available. The original negatives of important films are often lost or destroyed. Other times, films are only made available in inferior forms. Amadeus has only been released on Blu-ray in the director's cut, which is widely agreed to be the worst version. The Star Wars negatives were famously and permanently altered with special editions, which led to fans taking restoration efforts into their own hands, usually with better quality than Lucasfilm's own offerings.
This is the restoration of this shot. Here's the Blu-ray. I swear I'm not making this up. The red has been boosted up so bad it's turned into a comb.
Fans aren't limited by deadlines and budgets, and technology has enabled them to pick up the slack when a company fails. Video games aren't that much different. The only version of Silent Hill 2 playable on modern systems is the disastrous HD collection port.
Fucking Hijinks Studios thought it was necessary to change the fucking font to Comic Sans.
With Konami moved on to pachinko machines, it's safe to say that they don't care which version of the game they leave behind. A team of modders recently fixed up the out-of-print PC version, but more to the point, PlayStation 2 emulators have allowed people to play the original release for years. Building an emulator like this is an immense job. Developers have to make a lot of assumptions about how the original system operated, and for every problem they fix, 2 more take its place. It takes years before games are even playable, let alone good, and developers don't do this just because they want to pirate games for free. They do it for the same reason that fans restore classic film negatives, because they care about these games and want them to exist forever in the best possible form. Newer consoles make it easy to get legal game dumps with homebrew apps, but older systems have a more complicated process with specific hardware requirements, which is why ROM sharing is so popular. By attacking ROM sites, Nintendo is jeopardizing these efforts to preserve gaming history, because they've failed to provide an adequate replacement for what those sites offer. I'm not in any way advocating piracy or encouraging anyone to download things they haven't paid for. I'm just asking, what if? What if Nintendo succeeded in their efforts to shut down all ROM sharing sites and ended all unofficial emulation of their games?
Would you like to see a world without emulation, George?
Oh, that sounds cool as shit, mister. Let's go!
Nintendo's platforms make up the biggest and most important retro library held by any company, and the Wii Virtual Console is their biggest push to sell them to date. I'm going to repeat that. Nintendo's retro game library peaked in the Wii era. The emulation was bare bones with no visual options or button remapping whatsoever, with certain titles requiring a claw grip to play. It's not as if the Wii couldn't have done better than this. A modded Wii can run fan emulators that have far better features. Not only have fans made better emulators on PC, they've made better emulators on Nintendo's own hardware. The service ended at 397 games, which is not a lot when considering the number of systems supported. The N64 only got 21 titles. Among the games that never made it onto the service is GoldenEye, one of the most important games of its generation. It's never been re-released due to its entanglements with Nintendo, Microsoft, and the James Bond license, and it's not as if these companies haven't tried. Microsoft had to shelve a remastered version, and Activision and Nintendo settled for a remake that contained none of Rare's game design. It's entirely possible that the game will never be released again, and in a world without emulators and ROM sites, that means you'll never play the game again.
This is where I used to play GoldenEye. Slappers only.
The original hardware isn't the answer to this problem either. It's not practical to have dozens of systems on hand to play classic games, systems that wear down and become harder to repair over time, with connections that future displays won't support, and cartridges with batteries that die and render the games unplayable. At some point the hardware will be gone and these games will have to be emulated in order to exist, and you can expect a substantial loss of gaming history if a company like Nintendo is the only game in town. The original hardware is also no help for games that never released in the first place. If Seiken Densetsu 3 isn't familiar to you, you might recognize it as Secret of Mana 2, a sequel to one of the most beloved games on the Super Nintendo. Despite being regarded as an even better title, it's never been released in the West. Downloading an English patched ROM has been the only option for the majority of American players to experience this game, which raises the question of whether it's immoral to pirate a game you never even had the chance to buy. Are you willing to accept that you'll never play highly acclaimed games and entries into series that you love simply because the publisher didn't bother? Because without emulators and ROM sites, that choice is made for you. You won't.
Hey, now, this is a bunch of crap. I was a level 59 Ninja Blade.
Nintendo simultaneously made the Virtual Console better and worse when jumping to the Wii U. The games now had button remapping and save states, but the vast majority of games still had no visual options and were locked to a dull, dark picture. Instead of starting where the Wii left off, the entire library had to be rebuilt on Wii U, leaving players who had to wait for their favorite games to appear on the Wii to once again wait for them to be uploaded on Wii U so that they could pay an upgrade fee and play them in a worse-looking form. The Wii U eShop ended at 311 games, a sizable step down from the generation before. It's worth noting that these storefronts are only temporary. The Wii Shop is on the verge of a total shutdown, leaving Nintendo's largest retro library permanently inaccessible. The Wii U eShop will certainly suffer the same fate, making the entire Virtual Console a meaningless footnote in the long term of game preservation. From here, Nintendo dabbled in classic consoles. As fun little novelty items, they're pretty neat. As a method of preserving a retro library?
No fucking way.
The systems include a few dozen titles with no option to buy more, making it a Noah's Ark-like situation where the vast majority of titles are left to drown. The emulation at least offers some basic visual options, but still pales in comparison to PC emulators. It goes without saying that these systems aren't even on the radar when it comes to serious efforts at preservation. That leaves us with Nintendo Switch Online, which appears to use the same emulator as the NES Classic. Button remapping is once again not available, conveniently making Nintendo's $60 controllers the most comfortable option. Resolution is capped to 720p, which may seem like a silly complaint, but is important for how the games scale, and particularly for scanline filters like the one Nintendo is attempting here. Games are still being added at a snail's pace, with the libraries beyond the NES not started yet. I'm going to guess that the service will slowly build to a library that is at best somewhat larger than the Wii before Nintendo jumps to another architecture and forces the whole thing to start over once again. Nintendo has never made the preservation of its retro games a high priority. It's always been a neglected side project, an extra feature to boost the appeal of their current system, or in this case, to polish the turd of an online paywall. In the 12 years that Nintendo has been in the business of selling classic games on a large scale, they've yet to find an acceptable long-term solution for making them consistently available. And in a world without fan emulators and ROM sites, gaming history is entirely at the mercy of these half-hearted efforts. This is opposed to playing every video game ever made in any resolution or aspect ratio with any controller you want in any configuration you can imagine with custom filters, unlimited save states, texture packs, mods to add new gameplay mechanics, and entirely new games built out of ROM hacks. Again, I'm not advocating for piracy on PC. I'm just pointing out that there's a reason it's so popular, and it's not because people are cheap and don't want to pay. If Patreon is any indication, people are willing to shell out a lot for quality emulation. Valve considers piracy to be a services problem. When legitimate services fail customers, they resort to piracy to get what they want instead. And that's basically the problem Nintendo has. People aren't downloading ROMs because they're bad people who want to do bad things. They're doing it because PC is a superior platform to Nintendo's services in every way. If Nintendo really wants to stop piracy of their games online, their efforts shouldn't begin with lawsuits and takedowns. They should begin with building a better service, one meant for the long term that won't die out every time they change hardware, with a more complete library and emulation that isn't put to shame by what fans were doing a decade ago. I don't have the answers for how they can do that, but here's a crazy idea that would never work. What if Nintendo opened a ROM site, and tolerated PC emulation and provided a legitimate way to access their games? They wouldn't have to do any work other than just hosting the ROMs and taking the money. If Nintendo could fill the role of the sites it's closing